This is the story of the Ibibio Wars. The truth about Africa from Africans. The Ibibio Wars isn't just a tale of conflicts. It is the slow, deliberate weaving of power, faith, and warfare in what is now southeastern Nigeria before the arrival of European colonial forces. Long before the Union Jack touched the Cross River, the lands between what is now today Abia State and Akwa Ibom State in Nigeria were all their life with alliances, betrayals, migrations, and the thunder of unfamiliar weapons, muskets and cannons that would change the region's destiny. Sometime in the late 17th century, though the exact dates blur depending on who tells the story, the Ibibio people had already established themselves as a dominant force in the lower Cross River Basin. They occupied the region that would later become known as Arochukwu. Then it was called Obinkata, a strategic location surrounded by dense forests and interlaced waterways. The Ibibios weren't newcomers. They had built a structured society with a strong sense of identity and a kind of decentralized governance that relied on kinship networks and spiritual authority. For a time, they controlled trade routes leading into the hinterlands and coastal zones, setting the terms for anyone who passed through. But migrations from the north, particularly the Igbo groups from the Abiriba-Ohafia axis, began to increase. Some came peacefully, others less so. Among them were groups led by ambitious individuals, many of whom would later play crucial roles in forming the Aro Confederacy. Tensions grew as these settlers sought land and influence. Ibibio elites, already established in Obinkata, began to view the newcomers with suspicion. What followed wasn't a single battle, but a drawn-out conflict, a series of military and spiritual confrontations that over time shifted the power balance in the region. Initially, the relationship between the Igbo migrants and the Ibibios was uneasy but not openly hostile. The newcomers, led by figures like Agu Inobia, settled under Ibibio sovereignty, paying homage and accepting local authority. But as their numbers grew, so did their confidence. Agu Inobia, a charismatic leader, began consolidating the scattered migrant communities, bringing them under a kind of proto-military leadership. His goal wasn't open rebellion at first, but power has a way of drawing lines where diplomacy once stood. The Ibibio leadership responded by tightening control, imposing levies and restrictions that the Igbo settlers found increasingly intolerable. Skirmishes broke out. These were mostly small raids on farms, ambushes on trade routes, but they set the tone. Eventually, these tensions escalated into full-blown war. When Agu Inobia died, his mantle passed to his son Nachi, a man remembered not just for his leadership, but for his cunning use of both military and spiritual power. Nachi realized that defeating the Ibibios in their stronghold would require more than courage and spears. The Ibibios were militarily experienced, entrenched, and spiritually united. Their war rituals and shrines gave their soldiers a strong logical edge. Nachi, understanding of spiritual legitimacy in warfare, reached out to a distant ally, a group from the east known as Akpa. Some say Efik or Akpa origin was possibly linked to present-day Cameroon. The Akpa people were different. They brought something the Ibibios didn't have: muskets and small cannons. These weapons had trickled into the interior through trade networks stretching from the coastal Efik traders, who themselves had obtained them from European merchants. At this stage in African history, muskets were not common in the hinterland. Their mere sound could unsettle seasoned warriors. Cannons, even small swivel guns, had a psychological impact that often outstripped their actual destructive power. The boom echoed through forests, shattering the calm of traditional warfare rhythms. When Akpa answered Nachi's call, led by their war leader Osem Nkwe, the balance began to shift. The Ibibio War wasn't a single decisive clash. It stretched across multiple campaigns, each marked by different tactics. The Ibibios preferred fortified positions. They relied on their knowledge of the terrain, constructing defensive stockades and fighting from elevated grounds. Their warriors were skilled in close combat, using spears, machetes, and bows with poisoned arrows. The Arochukwu coalition, on the other hand, mixed traditional Igbo raiding tactics with new gunpowder warfare. Akpa musketeers were positioned behind advancing Igbo infantry, firing volleys to disorient defenders before spearmen moved in. Cannons, usually light ones, mounted on logs, were dragged into position and used to break stockades or simply terrify defenders into retreat. Military campaigns often began with spiritual consultations. Diviners and oracles were consulted before major offensives, determining auspicious days for attacks. This wasn't superstition. In their eyes, it was strategy. Morale and divine favor were intertwined. One of the most decisive engagements took place near Obinkata itself. The Ibibios had fortified their settlement, believing the forested approaches and their shrines would repel attackers. But the coalition forces encircled the settlement and unleashed coordinated musket fire, followed by cannon bursts, and smashed through wooden defenses. Confused and demoralized, Ibibio warriors fell back in disarray. The war dragged on, with guerrilla skirmishes and ambushes, even after major Ibibio positions fell. But gradually, the coalition tightened its grip, cutting off escape routes and supply lines. It was both military force and relentless pressure that broke Ibibio resistance. The military success of the Arochukwu alliance laid the groundwork for what would become the Aro Confederacy. Contrary to later assumptions, the Aro military wasn't a standing army in the modern sense. It was a networked structure, drawing on allied towns and warrior society. War leaders, known as Agbu, coordinated campaigns but depended on support from different clans. Specialized gunmen, mostly of Akpa origin and trained Aro musketeers, formed the firepower corps. Warrior guilds, particularly from Ohafia and Abam, acted as shock troops. Their reputation for fearlessness was as valuable as their fighting skills. Logistics were handled communally. Food, gunpowder acquired through trade, and manpower were contributed by different towns in exchange for a share of the spoils and future trade privileges. This decentralized but highly cooperative structure allowed the Aro to project power far beyond Arochukwu in later centuries, eventually extending into parts of the Niger Delta and the Middle Belt. With the Ibibio power broken, the coalition founded Arochukwu, with Nachi's lineage and Osem Nkwe's Akpa warriors playing pivotal roles. Arochukwu became both a political capital and a spiritual nerve center. This new power structure was unique. It combined Igbo chieftaincy traditions, Akpa military influence, and religious authority centered on the Ibini Ukpabi oracle, also known as the Long Juju. The Eze Aro or Aro King emerged as a figurehead of unity, balancing spiritual authority with political coordination. The oracle priest became a crucial power broker, as the oracle's pronouncements shaped decisions on war, diplomacy, and trade. The Council of Elders and war leaders managed external relations, alliances, and trade networks, particularly the slave trade routes that would later narrow influence in the 18th and 19th centuries. This blending of civil, military, and spiritual governance was both pragmatic and strategic. It ensured loyalty through belief as much as through force. One of the most striking elements of the Ibibio Wars is the use of firearms before direct European colonization. While Europeans supplied weapons indirectly through coastal trade, it was local actors like the Akbar and later the Aro who adapted and integrated these weapons into indigenous warfare. This challenges the simplistic view that pre-colonial African wars were purely traditional. In reality, there was a dynamic military innovation happening long before colonial conquest. The fall of Ibibio dominance and the rise of Arochukwu set the stage for 2 centuries of Aro expansion. Their military, trade, and spiritual networks stretched across Igbo land and beyond, influencing regions far from their original homeland. They were more than just a clash between 2 ethnic groups. They were a turning point, a moment when migration, warfare, spiritual power, and technological adaptation converged to create a new political order. The combination of strategic alliances, the introduction of muskets and cannons, and a flexible but organized military structure allowed the Aro to overcome a well-established power and lay the foundation for a confederacy that would shape what is now southeastern Nigeria's history well into the 19th century. It is easy to imagine the shock of their first cannon blast echoing through the Ibibio forest. For some, it must have sounded like the world itself was splitting open. In a way, it was. A new world was being forged, not by distant Europeans, but by Africans reshaping their own destinies through war, faith, and politics.